Greetings, Imaginarians. This week I got something special for you. It's a conversation with Nick Iafrate of the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis, the U.S. branch. Nick invited me to come on to do a podcast with him on subjects of interest to the Institute, including analytical psychology, the biological theory of archetypes, philosophy of mind, a whole host of subjects. We cover a lot of ground with these. This week I'm going to do the first one of several, and hopefully you find them interesting and entertaining. So sit tight, and we hope you like it.
Dr. Eric Goodwin, thank you for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Good, good. As you know, we've talked previously a little bit about what you do, but I kind of wanted to get you on an actual recorded podcast to discuss your why, in terms of what kind of attracted you to Jung, and more specifically Anthony Stevens' work. And then depending on where the conversation goes, where do we go from here and where you're going from here?
Oh, okay. Well, I took a master's. I did a master's degree in anatomy and neurobiology, and my research there was genetics research on prostate cancer, which is pretty far removed from what we're talking about today. But as part of the coursework, we did a lot of neuroscience and studies, and I'd always since I was a kid been interested in dreams, trying to figure out. I want to know everything about them. What are they? What do they mean? What's the neuroscience? The mystical approach, the religious approach, all of it. And I had to kind of put that on hold for a little while. But then once I got into medical school, I started doing residency in psychiatry. It came back to me again. And so I started doing research again, just on my own, reading about what dreams are about. And it didn't take me very long to bump into Jung. But one of the things that I was curious about was his theory involves the collective unconscious and the archetypes and all of this kind of stuff. And I hadn't heard a whole lot about it in my own particular background in what they call, quote, hard sciences, unquote. And so I wanted to know more about that. And that was diving into that was what landed me with Anthony Stevens' work. He, as you well know, he has taken the neuroscience and evolutionary psychology and evolutionary science in general and applied it to Jung. And so I gobbled up everything that he wrote on the subject, actually started talking to him via email in his little fortress down there in Corfu that he never leaves from. And so we started talking about that, and I just sort of went from there. That was kind of the beginnings of the Neurobiology of the Gods, my first book. And so since then, I've gotten very interested in the question of the genome and how that connects to the idea of the collective unconscious. It's still an ongoing discussion. As we spoke about before, I gave a talk on that just recently, and we'll hopefully get to talk about that some today, because there's been a huge amount of knowledge gained about the genome and evolutionary science since Jung was around, and we're still trying to sort it out and try to figure out what does that have to do with the collective unconscious, if anything, and how do we do it? I think most importantly in a way that is non-reductive, and that's kind of been my mission. It's kind of ongoing since then.
I think it's a great mission.
Yeah.
I think it's a great mission. And it really brings something to the forefront of my mind, as you're saying it, is the discussion of the innate, and to what degree, is that expression, do we have that expression within our lifespan, and to what extent are we these egos just really kind of negotiating between not only the external pressures, but these innate genetic mechanisms that are numinous, as Jung would call them, right? And you know, for someone like yourself, I'm sure you've gotten a lot of backlash throughout your career in a very blank slate, tabula rasa-esque, you know, psychological domain in terms of what the current, you know, state is of U.S. psychology and the APA and whatnot.
Right. Yeah. The dreaded blank slate. So yeah, I don't know if I'd call it backlash so much, but I've had a lot of lively debates about this stuff. And more, I think as I go, I'm seeing that I think the problem is not so much a fundamental disagreement, really, so much as our backgrounds. Like, for example, with some of the discussions I've had with John Merchant, who is just a brilliant writer on Jungian theory. But his approach is very different from mine, and his background is very different. And you know, I come at it from the point of view of having come from biological science. And so when people start talking about innate factors in the psyche, to me, that's just like, well, yeah, duh, no kidding. It's easy to picture how that would work, because we've learned, you know, during the course of my education, you know, you learn all of this stuff about how the genome, you know, does all of these things, and it's easy to imagine. But if you don't have that background, I think it's easy to kind of take a look at it and go, well, yeah, but how does that work? And what about learning? And culture is such a huge influence. And yeah, it is. It's not wrong. But there are certain things that we don't need to learn in order to appear in the psyche. There are symbols that will naturally form themselves in the human psyche. And I'm to the point now, finally, where I think I can explain how that works in a way that doesn't overwhelm the listener with a bunch of genetics and neuroscience and all this stuff. It's just really hard to sort through all that. So I'm hoping then that it'll be easier now to see how there is a massive amount of innate infrastructure in the psyche that we inherit, just a matter of being Homo sapiens. And then on top of that scaffolding, there is an also massive amount of cultural info. I mean, the brain, the psyche is huge. There's a lot of stuff there. So, you know, and of course, another problem is that we've been tangled up in this nature-nurture false dichotomy for way too long. And I think one of the recent papers I just published on this and how the genome interacts with the idea of the collective unconscious. When I was going through the review process, you know, it became evident that I was in some ways kind of preaching to the choir. Like I was saying, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, that the genome creates rigid algorithms that have no input from the environment, but rather that the genome has still nevertheless a huge influence on how the psyche develops. And one of the reviewers, it was really helpful, was, you know, kind of explained that in some training institutions in Jungian psychology, the collective unconscious is thought of as being entirely innate, and just everything just, you know, comes to be because of the genome and all that, and there's no room for the nuance there. And to me, I was like, well, that ain't right either. You know. And so these other authors that I've butted heads with over the years, like Gene Knox and, you know, to a degree, George Hoganson, they're coming from that background, and which I didn't know about. See, so I'm thinking the backgrounds is a big issue here. And we get together, it's like when I'm trying to explain how it works, the idea of rigid algorithms has gone by the wayside a long time ago, but it's still apparently a common idea among maybe non-specialists. And so it is important for didactic reasons to go through why that's not an issue. But saying that is entirely different from saying that the genome is irrelevant. And like in the early 2000s, there was a very influential book by Gene Knox called Archetype, Attachment, and Analysis. And I'm going to have to, you know, send her a pint of beer or something one of these days, because her work spurred so much response from me. And I do kind of owe her for that, because a lot of what she said was brilliant but not right about the genome, and how it just, it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. But it took me a while to figure that out, actually.
Right.
And so anyway, that's where I'm at now, and that's kind of where we're going.
Yeah. Well, you're very much a systems thinker, and as a reader of your work, your books, I very much appreciate that, especially as somebody who is getting into the field. And I think I'm paraphrasing here. At one point, I think in Neurobiology of the Gods, you do talk about where does the gene in the story end, or along the lines like how do you differentiate, and where are those kind of pinpoints between the genome and then the kind of sociocultural story, the archetype, right? And
I've got better at that since over the years, actually.
Right. And it's interesting because it's something of the gene expression throughout the lifespan development of an individual. And as you talk about the symbolism of dreams, and you talk about the symbolism of metaphor. And it's always been very interesting for me to kind of think about how the unconscious decides these images that are presented to you.
Yeah.
And I think the point you just made was that, from a social perspective, in terms of that social transference, really, the sociocultural transference and influence, to the degree that the unconscious utilizes such images is prevalent, right? And I think that's what I really enjoy about Neurobiology of the Gods, because you articulate it, for me, quite well, honestly. I thought it's a phenomenal book.
Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it. I feel like with that book in particular, I have this problem with most of my books, but I mean, in that one in particular, I felt like I threw so much at the reader that it's just kind of hard to digest it all. Well, maybe I did a better job than I remember I did. But.
Well, as an ENFP, I'm looking at all the possibilities and all the different rabbit holes I can go down. So it's perfect because it's so dense.
I'm an ISTJ, in case you didn't know. Right? Yeah. So that's pretty cool. So so you bring up the question that's really been occupying me a lot lately, is where does the innate end and the not innate begin? And I feel like I've gotten a much better feel for how to answer that question now than I did a few years ago. And it's because the way that Jung talks about, so let me first get this out of the way. I got to say this. So Jung starts off talking about archetypes using this biological idea of their instincts, they're related to our evolutionary history and so forth. And then later in his career, he shifts gears and talks about archetypes and the collective unconscious on a more metaphysical level, like as a cosmic, kind of thing. And actually, I don't think that those two are mutually exclusive, but they're really hard to reconcile. And when you get into the scholarship of the archetypes, you bump into this all the time, where one scholar is talking about the late Jung archetype and another one is talking about the early Jung archetype, and they're just not communicating. So I have to start that out from the beginning. We're talking about the biological side. Now, I've written stuff about the metaphysical side too. I've taken a deep dive into philosophy of mind and all that kind of jazz. Maybe we can talk about that if you want. But just from the biological point of view, he brought up the idea of instincts and how our human instincts. At one point, he says something like, we all have human organs. They all have an evolutionary history. The psyche is the same way. It has its specific organs, and they have a specific function related to our evolutionary history. Unfortunately, he couldn't say anything beyond that because we didn't know anything else beyond that at that time. We learned about, we didn't even know what DNA was at the time of his writings. Nevertheless, he, in one of his later definitions of the archetype, he says that it's a human tendency to form the kind of symbols that you see in catalogs of cross-cultural symbolism. So it's kind of a roundabout way of defining it, but it's defined in terms of a tendency, which I think is really important, because it avoids the constant argument about, is he saying that we inherit images of, Zeus and all that? No, he's not saying that. He never was saying that. So let's just throw that out the window. He was saying, though, however, that we do have a strong tendency to create the same kinds of symbols and story structures over and over and over. Well, my question is, okay, but how does that work exactly? Why? And what about the genome, if anything, does that? If it's not the genome, what in the world would it be? And as I was mentioning earlier, with Knox's works in the early 2000s, anyway, they thought, well, the human genome is not sufficient to do that, to do what Jung is saying. It's not enough to be able to encode symbolic information, is basically what she was saying. We only have 30,000 genes on the human genome. How in the world does that work? I'm paraphrasing grossly here. Her work. There's more nuance to it than that, but anyway. So, my first objection to that then and now still is, well, how many genes is enough? We don't know that. And there's only 26 letters in the alphabet, and yet you can get the complete works of Shakespeare from that. So help me out here. But more than that, number one, we discovered there's a whole lot of genes on the genome that aren't protein coding, but they still operate as protein regulation, and they qualify as genes that from that point of view, because they code things like messenger RNA, transfer RNA, that is specifically designed to interact with other gene products. So I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this, but the 30,000 is not the number anymore. It's a lot higher than that. Nevertheless, that still doesn't tell us how it works. So, in other words, if a patient comes in and has a particular dream that seems archetypal, is there some way for me to be able to pick out what's the innate part of it and what's the learned part of it? And I think at this stage now I can, which may sound fabulous to some people. I know that in some of the literature on this, there have been some people that said that the personal and the collective unconscious cannot be truly separated. At the time, I was pretty convinced by that. There was one article in particular that's quoted a lot. And it is quite convincing. And yet now that I know more than I did then, I don't believe that anymore. I think that you can. And I'll give an example. So let's say you have a patient that comes in with a dream about inheriting a huge amount of money. And you work with that patient for a little while on the symbolism, and you come to realize that the money is not literal money, as dreams tend to not be literal anyway. But the money is a symbol of a value. Something happened in their life and it caused them to inherit a lot of money, and the dream is essentially using that as a symbol of life value and status, say. Very common symbol to be used. That's dream one. All right, so we'll put that on a shelf for a minute. Dream two, we'll say, is a dream about someone going into therapy. Right before they go into therapy, they have a dream about going into a dark cave and finding a fire within the cave, and meeting up with some kind of deity, say, and then coming out looking different. Okay, so dream two and dream one, you could argue all day long about the symbolism, but I think that you can make a strong case that the first one is not archetypal, but the second one is. The reason is because my criteria for archetypal is pretty specific. Again, that's another thing that's kind of been missing from the literature. Jung defined archetypes in so many different ways, and they've been used and abused and stretched beyond knowing what in the world we even are talking about anymore sometimes, which is frustrating. And so I always find myself going back to Jung and going back to what is the kernel of this idea that he's trying to get at here. And it's this idea of innateness. Is this something that we are born with? The cave and the darkness and the fire are all things that all humans are going to have a tendency to create as symbols, regardless. And I mean, truly regardless of culture. Money, on the other hand, is a relatively new invention. Now, it's an easy connection to equate money with social status and, power, because those two things do correlate in life. So it's a natural thing for the psyche to use as a symbol. But I'm not going to go so far to say that's an archetypal symbol, because it's only you're only going to be able to use that if you have ever learned of currency. Not every culture had currency. Now, funny thing, of course, in say a pastoral culture, you might see the exact same symbolism, but with cows instead of money. If it's where there's whoever has the most cows is the richest guy around. But nevertheless, darkness, on the other hand, like the dark forest, for example, I talk about that in some of my writings. Anyone can have a dream about that, and it's going to be an archetypal symbol of the unknown, of going into a place that is unsafe and full of potential danger. Nevertheless, it's full of life and of not self. And all of that stuff is going to get wrapped up in there, and that's an archetypal symbol. Now, you might say, okay, well, where on the genome is that? Okay, nice. That's a fun question. But we don't have to get that specific. We can say that look at our evolutionary history. We're visual, spatially oriented creatures. So regardless of what culture you are born in, as a toddler, at least, if not earlier, you're going to make the connection of vision with knowledge. Unless you're born blind. Okay, so in a situation like that, maybe not. You'd have to pick it up from the language use, and I think every one a person like that would. But if you're born, with vision and you encounter that, then you're going to make that connection. So what I'm doing then is I'm getting away from the idea that innate means rigidly specified by the genome in a way that does not require any environmental input. I'm saying no. It's a thing that the genome sets up and follows a universal trajectory. Sometimes it may even involve learning, but it's not cultural learning, right? So the trick here is, what do we mean by environmental input? Any reflex has environmental input. If I tap my knee, it kicks, right? Is that learning though? No, it's flexibility built into the system by the genome. And reflexes are there to help stabilize and support walking and balance and all that. But it has nothing to do with learning. So this is one of the main issues that I think has been plaguing this debate for so long, is we're conflating environmental input in a very broad and general sense, and learning, which is extremely specific, especially in humans, which can be very complex and very involved. And one of the examples I use for that is walking, learning to walk. So learning to walk is universal and it's innate. I think it's fairly easy to argue that. I don't know, too many people would disagree with that. But it still involves learning. The thing is, you don't have to teach a child to walk. They teach themselves how to walk. So things that operate like that, where you teach yourself that, and it develops on its own because of just your natural way that you interact with the environment, because you happen to be Homo sapiens in a terrestrial environment. That still counts as archetypal in my book, because it's universal. It doesn't have anything to do with culture. And it is itself expected by the genome. So the genome is much more sophisticated than just something that cranks out structures. It creates proteins, but it also for every one protein, there's probably 74 other proteins that modify the production of the first protein. And the first protein also interacts with all of the other 17 ones. It's so complex. And yet, natural selection doesn't care about any of that. All natural selection cares about is outcomes, is the endpoints. So if whatever mechanism gets you to be able to walk by age 1, then the genome is happy with that. And that is the functional trajectory that the genome is coding for. So I don't need rigid algorithms or non-interaction with the environment, which hardly ever happens, in order to demonstrate that something is innate. Now, so the question, of course, might circle back to, well, is that what Jung intended, though? I think it was, because in some of his writings, he talks about, like the leafcutter ant, in one of his essays, he talks about that, and how the way that they move is the demonstration of an archetype, which he felt was encoded in the genome. Now, there's some authors have gotten into the weeds with this and said, well, it's more to do with complexity and emergence and all that stuff. And I agree, but none of that is mutually exclusive with the idea of it being encoded and expected by the genome. See, so once you look at it that way, then you can take particular clinical imagery, dreams, visions, or whatnot, and it's not as difficult to parse out what is the innate and what is the not so innate, because the psyche is a symbolic, especially in the dream state, it conjures up symbolic narratives, but it'll take anything from anywhere to do so. It's very promiscuous in this sense, because it's got a job to do. And the job is very important. And that is, I got to figure out where I am and what my life means right now. What's my story so far? Boom, here's a dream. This is what I think my story is right so far. Then tomorrow I'll have another one. Now, if I've got the same problem going on, I'll have the same dream, because the psyche will come to the same conclusion. Yeah, you're still stuck here, bro. But,
Right.
all right. But some of the material that the psyche uses is inborn. It's stuff like that'll always be there if you happen to be a member of the Homo sapiens. So like the example I gave a minute ago about darkness and light. So light is always used as a symbol of safety, of knowledge, of, all those things. And it's embedded in our language, which I think we've talked about that before. If you see what I mean, and I have a different point of view from you, and his argument is murky and all that. Okay, but that's because of our anatomy and our particular human makeup. If, on the other hand, if rats could talk and create symbols, they wouldn't use that symbolism, because for them, light is terrifying. It means they're going to get killed by a predator. So for them, light equals danger, right? That's their dark forest, is a beam of sunlight coming down on them. Ah, get out of here, So their dream symbols would operate on that logic. Well, we never see that in humans, because the humans don't work that way, and that's where the innate symbolism, the particular logistics of the imagery comes from. Now, the meaning, of course, is greater than the parts, right? I'm picking apart the symbols into pieces parts, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, but then getting back to the idea of reductionism, I don't want to say that's all they are. Again, this is another ongoing debate. Some theorists, maybe you could argue Anthony Stevens, for example, might say that a particular symbol always means X. And I would not go quite that far. I would say that like light and darkness are always used in a particular way, but it might be combined with something else in a creative new way that no one's ever seen before. I doubt if it's going to be real common, because there's really very little new under the sun. But you never know. It could be. But we do come, I think, into the world with an alphabet of symbolism that by the time we get to where autobiographical memory starts to be really a thing, around age 4 or so. But most people don't think of this. We've learned immense amounts already by that point in our lives as toddlers, and I'm enjoying watching my grandchildren go through this phase right now. And man, they learn just like boom, 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 nonstop. And they're just soaking up all this stuff, but then all of that will get layered upon much more as the brain expands and they get even more sophisticated and all, but that stuff never goes away.
Right.
So that's like the foundation. Is it learned or is it innate? Yes.
Right.
It is learned and innate. It is innately guided learning. It is learning that builds upon innate principles, so forth and so on. And so once we recognize that, we can either say, well, then the collective unconscious is impossible because it has to be innate only. But that's just feeding further into this false dichotomy.
And it has to be externally oriented, right? I mean, in terms of that adaptation. And a lot of what you're saying resonates in terms of it being the case of what is the context of the individual.
Yeah.
These kind of unconscious processes that are screaming for communication and realization in the environment. And to the degree that they need external representation or actualization, could we potentially assume that the either the dreams or even idiomotor phenomenon, right? Psychobiological, phenomenon. To the degree that there needs to be some level of expression in the environment may be an increase in the degree in which these are very innately primal experiences in terms of the imagery and symbolism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And now you might ask, why should I care about all this esoteric, finery? At the end of the day, I still want to be able to apply all of this stuff to the patient I see
Right.
this afternoon in my counseling room. And I think it's important for this one primary reason, and that is if I'm going to go with the idea that there is a collective unconscious that is innate, that has its own set of rules, if you will, based on our ancestral history and not our personal individual history. So that's the big difference there for me. Being able to walk is made possible by our ancestral history. It's not anything we learn. Then whatever it is that the clinical material they present to me, if I can parse out what's the innate part of this and not, then I've sorted out a really important thing. Because let's say you have a patient, they have some kind of crisis, right, and they have a response to that in a vision or a dream or something like that. Well, that response could be either due to a learned association that they made, or it could be an innate response to that particular situation that the genome basically has in it to one degree or another. And the example I give to give an analogy here would be the shivering response. So our response to cold is very complex, it's very sophisticated, and it applies across the body. You take a Homo sapiens, right, normal temperature, et cetera, put them in a really cold environment, and a whole lot of things all happen at once. You've got blood that shifts into the internal organs and away from the extremities. If you do it for a long enough time, the blood vessels will actually sink lower down into the dermis. And then if it gets cold enough, you'll trigger a even more primal response, the shivering, to create heat so you don't instantly die. Now, you could ask yourself then, okay, where is this coming from? This is nothing that you learn to do. This has nothing to do with your personal individual history. You could go for 20 generations living in Hawaii and never know you had this ability until you went to Finland, and it was bloody cold. And so like the one grandchild, who happens to go up there and start shivering, well, what in the world's that all about? Right? Mm-hmm. It's nothing they learned, right? They just do it. All right. I think the psyche works the same way. You can be going along minding your own business and run into a particular scenario or setting that's particularly resonant, or in Jung's terms, something that humans have encountered time and time again. And the collective unconscious then will act like the shivering response. It'll bring forth a set of images and affects that are essentially because of our ancestral history and not our individual history. Mm-hmm. This is the dividing line for me, is if I can figure out that that's actually more from ancestral history, then that tells me I'm dealing with archetypes and I need to handle with care. Right, because the danger of archetypes is inflation, is in all sorts of trouble with that.
Introject, yeah,
all of that stuff.
Yeah.
All that stuff. You can get lost by them. You can get fascinated by them. They can inspire you. It's the way to healing and also destruction. If you're not careful, you not know which. I love the way Edinger puts it. He said, if we're going to operate with explosive chemicals in our laboratory, let us at least proceed with caution. And he's talking about archetypes there. So that's kind of the divider. If, on the other hand, it's involving symbolism that I know is probably more surface level, more individual history level, well, that's important for that reason. Mm-hmm. And of course, the psyche, being what it is, will blend the two things together almost every time. And so now I've got to figure out, okay, what's what here? And at this stage, I'm just figuring out how to sort it out. I have not quite figured out exactly what to do from there. But other than, be much more cautious with the archetypal material mm-hmm. than you might be otherwise. But I think the tendency has always been to either look at everything as either one or the other, because it's probably because it's just so hard to differentiate them out without really sorting through it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also begs the question, you know, and you mentioned this in your books and your work, you know, Panksepian, you know, instincts, the 7 basic instinctual systems, and you know, if we take those as a core foundation of you know, seeking, panic, rage, fear, play, lust, so on and so forth. And I know in neurobiology of the gods, you kind of you delve into the extension of that and how it might represent unconsciously, and then in social systems. I think if you look at those as a core foundation, the amount that they are unactualized might be, I mean, if it is prevalent, the individual context of that person experiencing what needs to happen might be very superficial in terms of the symbolism, or it could potentially be extremely deep. And I know personally, I've had dreams, and I've had hypnagogic experiences that you would, if I were to tell someone, it might be considered archetypal. But the immediacy of my own conceptualization of it was almost like a pulling away from that inflation, right? It's more along the lines of, well, hold on a second, what is underlying this? How can I pull away as much as I can from the kind of big, broad cultural idea of the image that I'm seeing?
Right, and that's probably wise. I mean, you can see Jung doing this in the Red Book, and deeply concerned about getting lost in these, you know, visionary, you know, spelunking expeditions that he goes on, and that principled approach is probably what kept him from totally losing it, you know, and just completely going off the deep end. So that I really admired that about him. His approach. It seemed like there was a lot of wisdom there. And you know, there was the conference I was talking about earlier that I went to a few years ago, and that was Mark Solms and a bunch of other brilliant people. You know, we talked about that, how you can run into these entities, if you will, and these you know, visionary experiences, and how troublesome it can be, how difficult it can be.
And this might be, you know, an issue with kind of pop psychology now, and in an issue with the perception, and again, I think this is why your work is so important, because you are bridging the divide between worlds, really, and for the majority of individuals who, I would say, aren't truly familiar with Jung, their exposure to Jung is this very psychologized, inflated, archetypal theory that even the people that are, you know, touting it really don't know too much about in general, right? So yeah, I definitely can see it being very dangerous. And I love Edgerton's quote as well. You know, you are playing with explosive material. How do you see yourself? Where do you see yourself going in the future with this? I mean, we discussed a little bit about, you know, the impoverished gene, Knox's work, and what you're doing there. You know, to what degree do you see this? You know, well, generally, where do you see yourself going with it in your own work?
Right now, I'm working on. Okay, so one of the biggest problems with archetype theory is the definition of the archetype has been so nebulous. I was complaining about that earlier, and you know, I'm not the first one to complain about that. And part of it is Jung's fault, but I think most of it isn't. I think most of it is people kind of taking the idea and kind of run off and to who knows where with it. And what I've been trying to do with some of my newer writing is say, all right, let's calm down. Let's try to pin this down a little more precisely and say, what do we mean by an archetype? And I do believe that Jung's differentiation between the archetype as such and the archetypal image, even though it was based on his sort of muddled flirtation with Kant, which I don't want to get into. The differentiation, I think the distinction is still pretty useful, because he's talking about, okay, the archetype as such is the part that you inherit. and the kind of like the apparatus through which you can teach yourself how to walk. Right? That's the archetype as such. But you still got to do the work, and you still got to have the input. Yes, you generate your own input in that sense, a lot of times. So, yes. Nevertheless, I have seen so many different things identified as archetypes, it drives me bonkers.
Right.
And more, I'm narrowing it down to say, okay, things like number. No, I don't see that as an archetype. No, it is an archetypal element. This is the piece I'm adding to this. And what we really inherit is bits and pieces of symbolic associations. We either inherit them completely, like they are generated without any input from the environment, which is rare, or they're more like learning to walk, and that there's a strong tendency and we all arrive at the same conclusion just because we happen to be Homo sapiens in a terrestrial three-dimensional environment. So things like height equates with power, for example. That's an element that finds itself in all sorts of symbolism. Number, I talk about that in Neurobiology of the Gods, how we're very much genetically encoded to group things into natural grouping things into numbers. We talk about light. There's a zillion of those, like faces, for example, facial expressions, or body expressions even. Again, another thing I touch on in Neurobiology of the Gods, but if we have the same body expression of a particular emotional state, like joy, where you expand and you're up and your arms are up in the air, yay, versus defeat, where you kind of scrunch down and you make yourself smaller. There's studies showing that people do this even if they are born blind, in which case they never observed anybody do that. So why do they do it?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a natural tendency to associate body postures with emotional states. Same thing with facial expressions. People will have particular expressions even if they're born blind and deaf. So people will have the same facial expression when they feel the same emotion, even if they're born blind. So they didn't see anybody else smiling. So why should they smile when they're happy? Right? But they do. Right? They just do. And there's good reasons for this, because this is based in animal communication modes. It's very important for animals to understand the other animal's emotional state too. Like, is this guy going to challenge me for a mate or for food, or is he going to slink off? I need to be able to figure that out if I'm so not only is the behavior hardwired, although I hate that terminology, but yeah, it's kind of hardwired, versus the ability to recognize it, all of that's going to be encoded.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So those are archetypal elements. Those are things that make up archetypal images. Those are the alphabets. Those are the letters of the alphabet, I should say. Archetypal images are words or even paragraphs. Sometimes they're so complex, but they are symbolic stories or images that represent human emotional states of great intensity. If it's not that, then I don't think it should qualify as an archetypal image. You can give all kinds of examples, like a cake recipe is not an archetypal image, because it's not even a story.
Right.
It's not a symbol of anything. But the element of symbolism is key, and the emotion is key. Of course, a lot of authors like Marie-Louise Lafrance talks about that at length, about how if there's no emotion there, it's not an archetype either. And I don't feel like a lot of that gets enough attention, really. We're so, I guess, too many intuitive thinking types out there. They just get lost in the imagery itself. But the emotion is super important. It's got to be there, or else it doesn't count.
Right.
It's got to be an emotion. It's got to be a symbolic narrative in response to a timeless emotional event. In response probably to a timeless situation that gives us that. Is that making sense?
Yeah. And I mean, and then you mentioned this. You mentioned this several times, but this is why in our previous conversation, this is why we keep on telling the same story over and over again, or these same stories over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think it's interesting. I look at it, and the way I'm conceptualizing it now is, you know, you have all these letters, but within someone's own lifespan development, it's just like, what words are they building? What words are they putting together?
Yes.
And it's not to say that you should look at the external words that of these stories and say, oh, that's my word. It's just like, no, you need to find out what your word is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. So we have we inherit the alphabet that comes from the genome.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there is still learning involved, but it's not the kind of learning we're really concerned with, which is
Right.
the observational or didactic kind of learning from caretakers.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kind of learning involved there is only going to be things like self-taught learning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. That's inherited. But the archetypal images themselves, the psyche can take those letters and put them into whatever it needs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason why they get repeated all over the globe is because the same sorts of situations keep popping up, and the response is going to be the same. The words are going to be roughly the same. And there's a couple of strengths to approaching it this way, I think. One is that it helps to explain why the archetypal images cannot be counted. There's too many of them because there's so many combinations of these elements. Now, the elements themselves might be more finite in number, and I've identified quite a few of them, but I'm sure there's some I haven't thought of. But I think we might have better luck numbering those. The facial expressions, height, shape symbolism, like the circle representing balance and wholeness. Why would that be? Well, the circle is the most symmetrical two-dimensional object, mathematically speaking. So it's a natural fit. So it doesn't take a unique poetic genius for somebody to come up with that and get passed down throughout the ages and across the lands. It's something anybody could come up with on their own, mm-hmm. because the psyche is actually pretty darn clever that way. Go figure. And it's not just constantly regurgitating stuff that was implanted into it at age 2. I've never had much patience with that kind of approach. Unfortunately, that's what you get with this sort of blank slate approach that you were talking about. Anyway, getting off subject. The fact, though, that so we can, one of the strengths is that it helps to explain why we can't number them, which is a criticism that some people levy at analytical psychology. Well, how many archetypes are there? Well, okay, how many words are there? Of course, and not all words are equal either. Some of them are going to be stickier than others. But that's another subject. It helps to explain why you can inherit a tendency without inheriting the image, mm-hmm. right? Because the elements are what's inherited, but the way that the psyche puts them together will vary depending on what's going on in your life. And that innate response to what's going on is going to be that voice that you hear in the back of your mind, or that might smack you upside the head in a big vision or a dream. And you'll wake up going, what the heck was that all about? And it'll be so out there. Jung talks about that in his seminars, is that an archetypal dream will hit you and you'll be wondering where in the world it came from. But if you say the answer comes from ancestral memory, you might get labeled a kook.
Yeah.
But in fact, that's exactly what it is. The same thing just look at the shivering response I was using. There's a zillion of this in my writing, but like the shivering example is ancestral memory. It's there because of experiences that previous humans had with cold temperatures. And in fact, some groups of people mount a different response depending on their particular history, over thousands of years, granted. And that's a whole interesting subject in and of itself, getting into the genome, and then of course there's the epigenetic transmission of events that can, something really traumatic can affect the grandchild's DNA. I don't know if you knew that, but that's ancestral DNA or ancestral memory too. So it's that kind of thing. Is now analytical psychology to me is the only field of psychology that has any way of even addressing that question. Everyone else just sort of assumes that, or they either have a vague idea of instincts, or they just assume it's something they learned somewhere. And so they focus everything on the individual history. And this is where Jung is maybe the most unique and to me fascinating, is because he he said, no, there's more. There's way
Yeah.
more. There's way more. And that stuff that represents the way more, the ancestral stuff, is big. It's powerful. It's profound. It's spirit of the depths type stuff. And if you see it and you don't know what to do with it, you're missing out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it's tough to know when that's what you're looking at, because
Right.
there's so much confusion on this subject for so long. And it's mainly, like you say, I'm coming at it from an analytical perspective. It's a definition problem for the most part. It's terminology undefined.
Yeah.
So where am I going with this? I'm saying we need to define our terms
Yeah.
rigorously and then apply them, you know. And if you do that, it actually does help figure out what's going on clinically.
Right.
And in yourself, you know, if you're not a clinician and you're listening to this and you just want to know what's up with the dreams that you're having, you can do it that way. So it helps us to identify when we're seeing an archetype and when we're seeing not one. It helps to explain why they're not numbered, they're not easily numbered, explain why you can inherit a tendency without the imagery. It helps to make sense of the idea of ancestral memory. So there's a number of strengths.
Yeah. Would you say that inheriting, repeat that for me, please? It was inheriting the
tendency
to not
form
the image.
Right.
Right.
You inherit the tendency to form particular images. So like if you inherit
So
the tendency, I'll give you an example, right? If you inherit the tendency to equate height with power and light with knowledge and heat with passion, and I argue that every one of us inherits those tendencies to make those associations, and you inherit the tendency to personify, then everyone has within them the tendency, which may never manifest in their entire lifetime, but it's always there, that a sun god can pop up at any point in their life as a brilliant and powerful symbol of all of those things wrapped together in an image that goes beyond the parts. It's ineffable in fact, because it's a symbol. And as Jung points out, you know, the symbol is the best way to represent something, you know, whatever it is. And I may be able to identify the bits and pieces of it, but the whole is greater than the sum of those parts put together.
Mhm.
And so the experience of it is going to be numinous, because it contains all of that powerful symbolism within it. A being that is, you know, all around the world, as one of my videos talks about the sun god, right? And I go into this. All around the world, you see the sun is either the god or the abode of the god, or the son of the supreme deity, and all that stuff. And that's why. And I've had, of course, patients that would have either delusions about sun gods or dreams about sun gods. And when that happens, I know I'm looking at an archetype. I know for the most part what it's probably talking about too.
Mm.
The only piece I have to do is say, okay, that's what all this stuff typically means. Let's combine it with that person's experience, and now I'll have the whole picture.
Right. Right.
So I'm trying to help parse it out without reducing it down to its parts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's as soon as if I start off my talk about Jung and biology with that, I'm usually pretty good to go, because I don't have people saying, no, wait a minute, no, you can't reduce it down to genes. I know that. I'm not saying that. Hold on. Don't at me, bro. Right. So I can kind of progress from there, because that's what so many people are afraid of. They're afraid of, and Jung was, again, he was already there with this. He said, I describe things the way I do because I don't want people to try to reduce the psyche to a set of algebraic, you know, equations. I totally agree with that. And we might be able to explain all the parts, but that's not the whole.
Mm-hmm.
The whole is its own thing. So,
Exactly.
when you're talking about the numinous and the cosmic and mystical experiences, I think that is the experience of the whole that the self is only a part of. Like, we get a bare glimpse of it, and that's why it's so ethereal and fleeting, maybe. It would be like a blood cell getting a glimpse at what consciousness is like. But we can't have consciousness without the blood cells. And so they're essential, they are parts, but they don't tell you anything about consciousness on their own. You got to see the whole completely. But if I took the point of view of the blood cell, right, I'm tooling along in the blood vessel. But just for a second, I get a glimpse at what the whole body is doing. Then I think that's kind of what we're doing. If you happen to be one of those who's had like a cosmic vision or something, I get these sometimes. Some patients will tell me this. I take it seriously. I'm thinking, that sounds to me like a cosmic vision, like you had a glimpse there of the greater whole that goes beyond just the psyche, the individual psyche. And they are connected, of course, too. But that gets into the metaphysical stuff. So that's another rabbit hole to jump down.
Next time.
Yeah, next time.
Well, Dr. Goodwin, I really appreciate you giving me this hour. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward for people to see this. I definitely want to continue the conversation.
Fun.
I initially, you said experiencing the intent versus the image, and the first thing that came to my mind was like transgenerational complexes and hereditary complexes, and I'd love to pick your brain on that, and then personal narratives and personal myth. So thank you again. We'll do this again, and I appreciate it.
All right, look forward to it.
All right, sir.
Okay.
All right.